All right, if y'all remember from last week, which I can barely remember yesterday, but we continued in, let's see, let me hit the right button here so I can get to the right chapter. If you remember last week, we we started in 2 Kings 4, and we talked about the lady who had her husband had passed away, and she had back then the law was that if you couldn't pay your bills, that they could take your kids as slaves, and so that was going to that was going to happen. And so she prayed, or she went to Elisha, and we had the replenished oil. You know, Elisha told her to go gather vessels or jars, and so she did, and they went behind, and and that's all she had was one jar of oil, and he said, just keep pouring it into all the jars. Well, the oil just kept pouring and pouring until they ran out of jars. The jar that she had never ran out of oil, but they ran out of jars. But she was able to take all those jars of oil and sell that to pay the debt that she had. And then we talked about the family that Elisha would visit every time he would go through, and they liked him so much, and the woman wanted to build a room on top of her house where they lived, so that Elisha could stay each time. And so they did that. And then it was noticed, Elisha wanted to do something nice for them. It was noticed that they did not have any kids. Elisha told her that she would have a kid or a child within the next year, and she did. And but then the child was stricken and died, and the lady's faith went to Elisha, and said, why would you give me the son and then take him away? And so Elisha went to where the son was and laid on top of him, and then the young son sneezed 7 times and was alive again. And then we talked a little bit about Naaman, and how Naaman had been stricken with leprosy, and the young girl that was a slave girl there in his house had heard about Elisha and said, you need to go talk to Elisha. And so he did. Elisha said, go dip in the river 7 times, and he thought that was too simple. That's too simple for him to be cured of leprosy by doing such a thing. And so he got upset. And then Elisha's own men said, if he would have said to do something grand, you would have done that. But yet he told you to do something simple, and you chose not to do that. So then Naaman did go and dip in the river, and and he was healed. And so he wanted to pay Elisha something back, and Elisha, of course, said said no. But Elisha's servant, who was Gehazi, and this is kind of where we left off last week. Elijah's servant, Gehazi, he witnessed Naaman's wealth. And so let's pick up in verse 2 Kings 5, chapter 20. Verse 20. Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said to himself, "My master was too easy on Naaman, this Aramean, by not accepting from him what he brought. As surely as the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." So Gehazi hurried after Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running toward him, he got down from the chariot to meet him. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "Everything's all right," Gehazi answered. "My master sent me to say, 2 young men from the company of the prophets have just come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 sets of clothing." "By all means, take 2 talents, said Naaman. He urged Gehazi to accept them, and then tied up the 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 sets of clothing. He gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them ahead of Gehazi. When Gehazi came to the hill, he took the things from the servants and put them away in the house, and he sent the men away, and they left. And when he went in and stood before his master, Elisha asked him, "Where have you been?" "Your servant didn't go anywhere," Gehazi answered. But Elisha said to him, "Was not my spirit with you when the man got down from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to take money or to accept clothes or olive groves and vineyards or flocks and herds or male and female slaves? Naaman's leprosy will cling to you and to your descendants forever." And then Gehazi went from Elisha's presence, and his skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. So Gehazi got greedy. He saw the wealth that Naaman had, and where Elisha had refused to accept something as thankfulness for healing Naaman. He turned it down, but Gehazi went, caught up with Naaman, and Naaman, being so grateful, he doubled what he had asked, and he sent him away with servants to even help him carry what he was going to be taken. But upon his return, and I'm sure all of us when we were kids, and we'd show up in front of our parents knowing we had done something wrong, and mom or dad, they always had the 5th sense or the 6th sense knowing you'd done something wrong, and they'd ask you what you did, or "Did you do this?" "No, didn't do that." Well, Elisha was the same way. He had God's with him, and he said, told Gehazi, "Was not my spirit with you?" And so Elisha rebuked Gehazi for it, and he was stricken with leprosy, and which was, of course, the very disease that Naaman had been healed from. And in studying Elisha in 2 Kings, that's kind of in stark contrast of what Elisha has done. As we've studied Elisha, he's always helping. He's always being compassionate to situation that he comes before. But he pronounced judgment on Gehazi in this particular instant. And God, of course, knew Gehazi's heart, and not just his actions regarding this. And we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. Was he given an opportunity to repent for what he had done or not? We don't know that. But in any case, he was given the judgment of leprosy. So then, moving into chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, the company of the prophets said to Elisha, and so we're moving on to another story about Elisha. The company of the prophets said to Elisha, "Look, the place where we meet with you is too small for us. Let us go to the Jordan where each of us can get a pole and let us build a place there for us to meet. And he said, Go. And then one of them said to him, Won't you please come with your servants? I will, Elisha replied, and he went with them. They went to the Jordan and began to cut down trees. As one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head fell into the water. Oh, no, my lord, he cried out. It was borrowed. The man of God asked, Where did it fall? When he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and threw it there, and made the iron float. Lift it out, he said. Then the man reached out his hand and took it. This is, I find this is, something fairly simple, but yet something big. Here we go. Elisha really wanted to help. And the man knew that he had borrowed a tool from somebody, and it had broke. The axe head had fallen. Fell in the water, and so we all know what happens to metal when it falls in the water. It does not float, it sinks. And being able to see it, whether the water was murky or not, but being able to see it in the water may have been challenging. And of course there was probably a current, but Elisha said, throw a stick in the water where you saw it fall. And he did, and up floated the axe head. And so, once again, God's power through Elisha was demonstrated when we have this heavy metal, iron, defied gravity and floated into the water. So we see Elisha's compassion and God's compassion on a servant who was concerned about being able to return this tool, which this individual had borrowed. Yes.
I just think sometimes we underestimate ourselves and what God can do through us if we remain faithful and trust in Him, because that man was able to benefit from the man who trusted in God and just let it stick in the water. And so I think, that's one thing we have to continue to stay focused on, that we're an example of people that we can always show them the power of God if we're willing to step out there and be brave about it.
I think you're right. That, our faith, the faith that we show, is a tremendous example to others. And how we react to different situations is a testament to our faith in God. And I know I get the same way. I try to be calm. I try to be patient, but something can happen, and I might be gritting my teeth. I hear some of the things that some of our teachers, and I'm sure Olivet back there can and relates, but I hear some of the things that our teachers go through with kids and the disrespect that they have for students, for other students, for teachers, for staff. Lisa's aware of all that. Karen's aware of all that. I was in Karen's era, and I did not treat her that way, I promise. But they have no respect, and they just talk back, and it doesn't make any difference. And it's like, I could not have the patience, the calmness that some of these teachers have. I'd probably be one of these you'd read about on the 6 o'clock news, because I just knocked the fool out of them. And that used to be done in class, in schools. We had, just a side note here, we had over at the junior high, which is now Cuellar across the street here, we had out in the middle of the wings, big concrete platforms areas, and those were called idiot blocks. And the reason they were called idiot blocks, because if you got in trouble with your teacher while you're in class, the teacher sent you out to sit on the idiot block. And then when the assistant principal made his rounds, if you were sitting on the idiot block, then you got called to the office. And in the office is where your discipline was. And so, you were an idiot if you got caught on the idiot block, because you were going to be getting in trouble. And I got to tell this one story. I remember this. This is when we were in the new high school. The new high school out here, it was in 1976, which is now the old high school. First one to have air conditioning, so it was a great joy to be able to have air conditioning. But the way the wings came into kind of where the central office was, we had some idiot that he would pop a firecracker in the middle of the deal. And Mr. Banks was our principal. And Mr. Banks was 6'7", 6'8" or 9. You know, he was a big principal. And but one day, you know, he was going to catch whoever this individual was. And lo and behold, you know, here comes the young man who's popping firework, who would every once in a while pop a firework, and he happened to catch him. Mr. Banks walked over to him, picked him up by the collar, shoved him against the wall to his level, and he said, "I'll see you in my office." Sat him back down. He went to the office. So I got to be a witness to that, so I know it's true. But anyway, that's way off bat here. But anyway, but Elisha was a very patient man, except when it came to, he was a very patient prophet, except when it came to Gehazi. But anyway, he wanted to help this servant who was working in helping build this new place. And then we move to another story about Elisha, and in verse 8, the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, "I will set up my camp in such and such a place." The man of God sent word to the king of Israel, "Beware of passing that place, because the Arameans are going down there." So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on guard in such places. This enraged the king, Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, "Tell me, which of us is on the side of the king of Israel?" "None of us, my lord the king," said one of his officers, "but Elisha the prophet, who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom." "Go find out where he is," the king ordered, "so I can send men and capture him." The report came back, "He is in Dothan." Then he sent horses and chariots and strong force there. They went by night and surrounded. They went by night and lost my place. They went by night and surrounded the blah blah blah. Okay. My finger hit this and it slid all up. Okay, which verse was I? Okay, here. 14. Then he sent horses and chariots and strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. "Oh no, my lord, what shall we do?" the servant asked. And he said, "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, "Strike this army with blindness." So he struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. Elisha told them, "This is not the road, and this is not the city. So follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for." And he led them to Samaria. After they entered the city, Elisha said, "Lord, open the eyes of these men so they can see." Then the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked, and there they were inside Samaria. When the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, "Shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them?" "Do not kill them," he answered. "Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? Set food and water before them so that they may eat and drink, and then go back to their master." So he prepared a great feast for them. And after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. So the bands from Aaron stopped raiding Israel's territory. So here Elisha is once again in God's favor, and they God enabled Elisha to repeatedly warn King Joram of the enemy's battles plans. And this, of course, enraged the king. It's like, who's the traitor? What traitor do we have within our ranks? And the officers within the army, they said, it's none of us. There's not anybody that's leaking it. But they explained that Elisha was telling Israel's king the very words he spoke in his own bathroom. So he wanted to capture him. He found out that he was in Dothan. They surrounded the city. And then Elisha's servant informed Elisha of the troops being encircled around the city. But he calmed his servant by praying or by telling him that God's forces were with them and outnumbered the foes. And he prayed that his servant's eyes would be opened so that he would be able to see the army that protected them. And yes. That's very true, and that's a good point. And it's something yeah, you may have heard the saying. What was it? Don't tell God about your great big problems. Tell your problems about your great big God. And and God, as we talked about last week, God is always with us. He's never going to leave us. He's never going to forsake us. And we have to remember that. And in our prayers, we have to pray that our eyes will be open to see what God's will is in in everything that goes on. Amen. So anyway, he after God opened his servant's eyes, then Elisha prayed that the eyes of the other soldiers would be blinded. And so then he led all of them back into the capital city of Samaria to stand before Israel's king. But rather than killing them, then Elisha advised the king, let's feed them and send them back home. And so this act of mercy upon the soldiers of the Arameans actually brought Israel a reprieve from the battles, from the raids of the Arameans. In verse 24, we read, sometime later, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army and marched up and laid siege to Samaria. And there was a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. As the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried to him, "Help me, my lord the king." The king replied, "If the Lord does not help you, where can I get help for you? From the threshing floor, from the winepress?" Then he asked her, "What's the matter?" She answered, "This woman said to me, 'Give up your son so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we will eat my son.' So we cooked my son and ate him. The next day I said to her, 'Give up your son so we may eat him.' But she had hidden him." When the king heard the woman's words, he tore his robes. As he went along the wall, the people looked, and they saw that under his robes he had sackcloth on his body. He said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today." Now so the king is blaming Elisha for this. So now Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. The king sent a messenger ahead, but before he arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Don't you see how this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold it shut against him. Is not the sound of his master's footsteps behind him?" While he was still talking to them, the messenger came down to him. The king said, "This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" Elisha replied, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a seah of finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." The officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of the heavens, could this happen?" "You will see it with your own eyes," answered Elisha, "but you will not eat any of it." So the Arameans, who were a constant foe of Israel, they brought trouble upon Israel again. And Aram's king, Ben-Hadad, sieged on the capital city again. And so a famine happened. Food was scarce. The Israelites were slowly being starved. And even food which was undesirable to eat, such as donkeys' heads and seed pods, and cost more than what people could pay. And it was desperate in that time because it even led to cannibalism of a woman, and a woman complaining to the king that her friend had convinced her, and this is hard to imagine, but had convinced her, "Let's sacrifice your son, let's eat your son, and then tomorrow we'll eat my son." And so, of course, that didn't happen, and so she was upset, complained to the king, and then that really upset the king. He grieved about it all. He was angry. He tore his robes and revealed that he was wearing sackcloth. And but these events fulfilled a prophecy that was given by Moses regarding the devastating consequences of those who rejected God. And Israel's king, Joram, refused to accept the personal responsibility for the famine. And instead, he turned his anger on Elisha, and he sought to behead him. He wanted his head that day. And so Elisha faced yet another threat on his life. And, Elisha so often was an agent of mercy on God's people, but he spoke prophetically that the famine would end the very next day. And, this goes, as we go through all of the Old Testament, it was always God wanting his people to obey. God wanting his people to obey, and he continued to give them opportunities to obey. But here again, he showed kindness over his rebellious people, and was going to let the famine end. But the there was a doubting Thomas back then, and said that the skeptical messenger, he scoffed at Elisha's prediction, but Elisha promised the king that he would see God's promise fulfilled, but he would not eat of any of the abundant food himself. So in chapter 7, verse 3, now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate. They said to each other, "Why stay here until we die? If we say we'll go into the city and the famine is there, we will die. If we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender. If they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we die." So, they said, okay, well, let's either go inside the city, let's stay here, or let's go to where the camp of the Arameans are. And they've got food, so maybe we can eat. So at dusk they got up, and they went to the camp of the Arameans, and when they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there, for the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they said to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and Egyptian kings to attack us." So they got up and fled in the dusk, and abandoned their tents and their horses and donkeys. They left the camp as it was and ran for their lives. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank. Then they took silver, gold, and clothes and went off and hid them. They returned and entered another tent and took some things from it and hid them also. And then they said to each other, "What we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace." So they went and called out to the city gatekeepers and told them, "We went into the Aramean camp, and no one was there, not a sound of anyone, only tethered horses and donkeys, and the tents left just as they were." The gatekeepers shouted the news, and it was reported within the palace. The king got up in the night and said to his officers, "I will tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know we're starving, so they have left the camp to hide in the countryside, thinking that we'll surely come out, and they will take them alive and get into the city." One of the officers answered, "Have some men take 5 of the horses that are left in the city. Their plight will be like that of all the Israelites left here. Yes, they will only be like all these Israelites who are doomed. So let us send them to find out what happened." So they selected 2 chariots with their horses, and the king sent them after the Aramean army. He commanded the drivers, "Go and find out what has happened." They followed them as far as the Jordan, and they found the whole road strewn with the clothing and equipment the Arameans had thrown away in their headlong flight. So the messengers returned and reported to the king. Then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. So a seah of the finest flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel, as the Lord had said. Now the king had put the officer on whose arm he leaned in charge of the gate, and the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died, just as the man of God had foretold when the king came down to his house. It happened as the man of God had said to the king, "About this time tomorrow, a seah of finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." The officer had said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of the heavens, could this happen?" And the man of God had replied, "You will see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it." And that is exactly what happened to him, for the people trampled in the gateway, and he died. So once again, the prophecy that Elisha had told these people came true. The lepers went and to check things out. They see that they're gone. They take some plunder, food. Then they go tell the city, and then the king doubts, and they send some out to go check everything. God had caused the Aramean army to hear things, to hear what was many chariots, many soldiers, and it scared them, and so they took off running. And and so the famine was over. And so once again, Elisha was God's messenger to save the Israelites. And then I want to get just right into the first part of chapter 8, because we've studied about this last week. Chapter 8. Now Elisha had said to the woman whose son he had restored to life. Remember, we had the lady who built the place on top of her place for Elisha, and then she had a son. The son died. Elisha restored the life to the son. So that's the lady we're talking about, the Shunammite woman. And so Elisha said to the woman whose son he had restored to life, "Go away with your family and stay for a while wherever you can, because the Lord has decreed a famine in the land that will last 7 years." The woman proceeded to do as the man of God said. She and her family went away and stayed in the land of the Philistines 7 years. At the end of the 7 years, she came back from the land of the Philistines and went to appeal to the king for her house and land. The king was talking to Gehazi. Remember Gehazi? The king was talking to Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, and had said, "Tell me about all the great things Elisha has done." So the king is inquiring about Elisha. And Gehazi says that the servant, just as Gehazi was telling the king how Elisha had restored the dead to life, the woman whose very son Elisha had brought back to life came to appeal to the king for her house and land. And Gehazi said, "This is the woman, my lord the king, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life." The king asked the woman about it, and she told him. Then he assigned an official to her case and said to him, "Give back everything that belonged to her, including all the income from her land from the day she left the country until now." So that was 7 years worth of money, of income that she had. So so Elisha, he still enjoyed friendship with the Shunammite woman, and who had provided the living quarters for him. And he was such good friends with them that he warned them, "Look, there's getting ready to be a famine, and it's going to last 7 years. So I encourage you to go to the land of the Philistines and live there during that time while the famine is here." And so they did. And because Elisha warned them that the Lord had decreed a 7-year famine. And so after the 7 years, the family returned and to discover that their house and home had been confiscated. And so the Shunammite woman went to the king to appeal for her property back. And at that very moment, what a coincidence, at that very moment, Elisha's servant Gehazi was recounting with the king all of Elisha's miracles. And so in God's perfect timing, just as he was telling the king about Elisha restoring the life of the dead boy, the woman happened to appear. And so the king restored everything to the woman, and including the income that she would have made from her land. So so once again, God compassionate on his people, and God's perfect timing on this when she was talking, when she came in to talk to the king, that Gehazi was there. And so God causes things to work in our lives for good. We don't know, and lots of times we don't know just exactly what God is working in our lives. And sometimes we don't see that for years or months, maybe the next day. But as long as we continue to have our faith in God, He will take care of us. And as we continue to go through this, through 2 Kings, and we're going to jump into 2 Chronicles a little bit. I mean, 2 Chronicles next week a little bit, because what's going on in the north, there's things that are happening at the same time in the south, which we'll kind of get into a little bit next week. But all of 1st and 2nd Kings are, the people wanted kings, and so God gave them kings. But you had kings that wouldn't follow God's teachings. They would start building idols. They would start building things upon the high hill. They would worship other things, and so and God always would call them back. And when that wouldn't happen, then we would have a punishment of a king, and then we would start with another king. But here again, all of the Old Testament leads to the coming of Christ, and talking about the one king that there would never have to be any more sacrifices for, and because he would be the sacrifice for all.